Okay, my name is Donnie Ertl. I was born on my folks' home on Center Street in Cedarburg, May 13th, 1930. In 1949, I got a job at the Keycafer Corporation on Western Avenue in Cedarburg. Worked on the sub-assembly line, and I started out for 45 cents an hour. I worked at the assembly line, learning all the different things there was to do on Mercury motor, and I got pretty good at it. I could do just about everything there was on a Mercury. My pay was 45 cents an hour. Later on, I had worked myself up to 86 cents per hour as a Class A assembler. I was one out of three of a group of six people who had that rating. I was offered a combination foreman position on the power headline, which I refused. Okay, Mr. Keycaver loved stock cars. One Sunday in 1951, Pappy Glick was a plant supervisor who was also a friend of mine, called me and Eddie Darko into work. We arrived to find Mr. Keycaver and Pappy Glick working on a brand new Chrysler car in the outboard testing room of the factory. They had a new Chrysler parked there, and Eddie and I got sandpaper handed to us, and we had to sand down the whole car, rough it up so they could paint it red. After it was painted, they entered the car in the Mexican road race in 1952. By the way, they didn't win either. In 1952, a truck driver driving position was posted on the company bulletin board. I applied for the job, but my plant supervisor would not let me go because I was a good assembler, I guess. Anyway, we haggled around for about a week and I finally got the job. I became one of the first truck drivers they had at Keycafer Corporation. I used to chase to Milwaukee 2-3 times a day to pick up parts for the assembly line. Twice a week, after 5 o'clock at night, I would take the pickup truck and go to Milford, Indiana, and pick up crankshafts at a factory that was making them for Keycafer Corporation. I would bring them back that night, and the assembly line would use them the next morning. In 1954, they sent me to Milwaukee one time to pick up a new Chrysler car, and I brought that back to Cedarburg to the factory and parked it there. So it stood there for a while. Okay, the vice president of the company, Lloyd Lohman, would sometimes call me at night to go to Chicago to the Midway Airport and pick up Mr. Keycafer. I did that quite a few times. On the way back, he said we should stop at the state line and have something to eat. So we did. So I said, let's go in the bar room first and have a drink before we eat. So we went in the bar room and we sat on two stools at the bar. And he ordered a cocktail and I ordered a glass of beer. He put down a $50 bill on the bar, and I put down a $5 bill. When the bartender brought the beer over and the drinks, I pointed to the $5 and I said, take it out of here. Mr. Keycaver kind of stared at me for a minute or two and he said, well, anyway, you'll put it on my expense account tomorrow. Then I told him I didn't have an expense account. So we both had a good laugh about that. After that, he always asked for me to come to Chicago or wherever and pick him up at the airport or whatever. So I kind of became a little bit of a chauffeur for him. Okay, one of the next days, he called me up to his office one morning and said I should follow him to Fond du Lac in that new Chrysler that I picked up at the dealer the other day. And he was driving a Porsche, so I followed him. We went out Western Avenue through Kirkline, and we got out to Highway 41. But the road wasn't fully constructed yet. It was just a concrete ribbon from Western Avenue all the way to Fond du Lac. There were no shoulders on the road, and they had all these pylons on both sides. Anyway, he put the hammer down, and I tried to keep up with him. I was driving 135 with our Chrysler, and he was pulling away from me. When we got to the factory parking lot in Fond du Lac, he had his car parked, and he was just getting out, and I pulled into the parking lot. And he hollered at me, "Ertl, what took you so long?" We both had a laugh, and then we both walked up to the sidewalk to the office, went inside, and he looked at his mail, and he said to me, "Well, let's go get something to eat." So we jumped into his Porsche and went downtown in Fond du Lac to the 101 Club, which was a pretty exclusive club at Fond du Lac at that time. We had a meal, and then we came back to the plant, and I jumped on the plane, the mail plane coming back to Cedarburg, and I got a free ride to Cedarburg with the pilot. In 1954, the company ordered a brand new semi tractor. It was a 54 Dodge, big 2.5-ton tractor. And they also ordered a 32-foot Fruhoff trailer, brand new. Then I was told the next day that I was going to be the driver. Okay. I didn't know how to drive a semi, but whatever. So I was driving the semi for 2 weeks. Those days they didn't have a truck driving school, training school. And I was driving the truck for 2 weeks. And Mr. Keycaver sent me to Greensboro, North Carolina, to a Western Auto warehouse with a load of Wizard outboard motors from Cedarburg. Okay, Lloyd Loman, the vice president, belonged to AAA, so he got me a triptych. Triptych is a little kind of a newspaper that you keep flipping the pages and shows you where you go. So I went up and down on a scenic tour. I went up and down 3 mountains on a 2-lane highway. I never met another truck all that way to Greensboro. After I was unloaded in Greensboro, I found the truck route, and I got my way back to Wisconsin with 1,000 other trucks on the road. Oh, then I got back, and the company sent me with a load of motors to Atlanta, Georgia, to the Mercury distributors in Atlanta for the whole state of Georgia. It was a COD delivery, and I collected $87,000. Of course, there was a check. I guess they wouldn't have trusted me otherwise. And I brought that back to the plant in Cedarburg and gave them the money. In January of 1955, the annual boat show started in New York City. So actually, it was December 29th of 1954. Mr. Keycaver had me load the Mercury outboard display into my trailer and take it to New York City. So I drove to New York City, and I came out of the Holland Tunnel, and there's a cop there with the streets going in many, many directions, and he was blowing his whistle, "Come on, move up." So I ended up, and I was driving through Central Park by mistake with a semi, but I made it through there. And I found the destination, the Coliseum, and there was a line of trucks 2 blocks long. So I parked at the very rear of the line, and I walked up to find a cop directing traffic there. My instructions were to find Dominic. He was the cop. And I shook his hand with a $20 bill in my hand, which was equivalent today to maybe a $100 bill. But anyway, he said, "Where's your truck?" And I said, 2 blocks back. He said, "Well, go get it. You're number 1 on the line." So then I went and got the truck, and then my instructions were to find Rocco. He was a receiving clerk. So I shook his hands with another $20 bill in my hand, and he let me right into the loading dock. And then I had to talk to the forklift driver, and it cost $20 more for him to unload my truck. So after it was unloaded, what do I do with the semi in downtown New York for 2 weeks? So I found a parking space right along the Hudson River, I believe. And as I was backing my semi into the area where he wanted me to park, I had to look out for some big lines coming down, and they were mooring lines for a ship. And I happened to look over, and I read the name on the ship. It said Queen Mary. So I parked myself right next to the Queen Mary. So Mercury Outboard and the Queen Mary, they didn't go together so good. 4 years later, I went to the New York Boat Show again, and I went through the whole procedure again. And I went up looking for Dominic, the cop. And there was a new cop there, and I asked him where Dominic was, and he said he's in prison. And I said, well, what happened? He was a cop that had a beat in Brooklyn, but he'd always jump on the trolley and come to downtown Manhattan and collect a lot of bribes for everybody that wanted to back into the building and get unloaded. So they caught up with him. So I told Mr. Keycaper about that, and we had a good laugh about that. Then one day the first day I was there, before the show opened to the public, the host of the Today Show was Dave Garroway. And he came around the whole show, showing off all the people, all the different booths. When he got to the Mercury Outboard booth, he also had a pet monkey in his arm. It was called J. Fred Muggs. So Dave Garroway gave me the monkey to hold. And then he and I walked around the whole Mercury booth, and I explained everything about the motors to him, which was fun. A woman was watching the Today Show in Cedarburg on TV, and she happened to see me on TV. So she called my mother and told me that she saw my son on national TV. Big deal, huh? Okay. Another one of the times we were at the show, I guess in 1956, a couple of us goes working in the booth. That night we went over to the Roseland Ballroom, which is a famous ballroom right on Times Square. And we walked into the building, and it was a dance land, and there was a band playing music, and there were the black guys singing. Well, a couple of us sat down at the bar, and then the band quit playing. So the band leader came over. Here it was Tex Beneke. He was playing the music of the Glenn Miller Orchestra in those years. And the black guy came over to the bar, and he sat down a couple stools from me. Here it was Sammy Davis Jr. that was singing. I thought that was pretty cool. And Tex Beneke sat at the bar, and we all had a couple drinks, and we were just BSing, and it was a lot of fun. One day I was walking down the street one day I was walking down the sidewalk, heading over towards the show, and I met Ed Sullivan walking on the sidewalk, coming towards me. I said, "Good morning, Ed." He said, "Good morning there, young fella." I thought that was pretty cool, that everybody recognized me, Okay. In 1957, I was at the Boston Boat Show. I was in the hotel nightclub in downtown Boston where they had a live band. The singer got up to sing the song. I think it was the Banana Boat song. And it was the Day-O. Here it was Harry Belafonte. I think he wrote the song too, I'm not sure. I thought that was kind of cool. This old Cedarburg kid from getting to meet all these celebrities, That year I was working the boat show in San Francisco also. A couple of us guys after the show, we went to Chinatown, and they had the Chinese New Year there. And they had this big dragon that about 20, 30 guys or Chinamen were underneath, carrying it down the street, and it was about a good block long. So that was a good experience also for this little Cedarburg kid. In 1955, Mr. Kickhaver started racing Chrysler 300s at all the NASCAR racetracks in the southeast corner of the U.S. We hauled 3 of the cars in 3 straight trucks to the racetrack each weekend for the races. It was fun. After the Saturday and Sunday races, we would take the cars back to Oshkosh, where they had a big garage on Murdoch Street, to work on the cars. get them ready for the next weekend's races. Sometimes I'd stay at an old hotel in downtown Oshkosh, which was a real dump. I remember the old hotel had old rooms with a sink next to the bed and a chain pull toilet on the other side of the bed. Or sometimes, if I was lucky enough, the plane was around and I'd get it right back to Cedarburg. Another time I was in the garage in Oshkosh and Mr. Keycaver drove me to the Ford dealer in Fond du Lac. We walked into the showroom together and he bought a brand new Mercury right off the floor and I drove it back to Oshkosh. So I parked it in the employee parking lot and two mechanics came out, jacked up the car and took the whole rear end out, wheels and all. They wanted it for a stock car and said one of the other stock cars they had ready to go. That new Mercury stood there for almost a year, and then one time Mr. Keycaver spotted it there and he told the guys to put it together again so they could start using it. One night I was in Oshkosh at the garage and Mr. Keycaver sent me to Detroit. So this was at night. So they had arrangements made. I drove to Manitowoc and got on the car ferry and they had a stateroom rented for me, where I could sleep going across Lake Michigan. And then the next morning, we landed in Ludington, Michigan, and I drove to Detroit. There I met the head engineer of the Chrysler Corporation. It was the year when they were just coming out with the brand new, I guess it was a 55 to 56 models. And Mr. Keycaver wanted one of those engines that they were making. Well, there weren't any engines on the floor in the factory, so they were just starting to load a semi out there with the first run of the new model year. The engineer had them take one of the cars off the truck again and bring it into the factory. And they took the engine out and put it back in my pickup truck. In the meantime, he took me out for lunch. I thought that was pretty cool. Then I went back to Oshkosh with that engine. Yeah. All right, Mr. Keycaver had such a clout with the Chrysler Corporation that they gave him anything for free that he wanted. In May of 1905, Mr. Keycaver and I were riding in a taxi back to our motel from the Richmond, Virginia racetrack. Mr. Keycaver always smoked cigars, but he was all out, so he bummed a cigarette from me. I thought, here, the guy's worth millions and he's got to smoke my cigarettes. After the race in Richmond, Virginia that we had lost, one of the mechanics found a champion spark plug that was fouled up. And he told Mr. Keycaver in the motel room later when we got back. He got so mad he called up the head of Champion Spark Plug and canceled all the orders for all the Mercury motors built in Cedarburg and in Fond du Lac. What a guy. Going back to NASCAR again, Keycaver had the best drivers at the time. Some of the drivers were Norm Nelson of Racine, Tony Bettenhausen, which won the Indianapolis 500 back in the 50s before he drove for us. And we had Buck Baker, Tim and Fondy Flack, they were brothers. Tim was a rum runner before he went to work for Keycaver. He had an old Chevy with the back seat taken out, and he had a great big tank in the back, and that's how he hauled booze around in North Carolina until Keycaver hired him. AAA became USAC later on, and then it just all died away. But we had 3 race cars we went to. I went with Norm Nelson and Buck Baker and Tony Bettenhausen. The 3 of us, they drove the cars. We had a race on Sunday in Kansas City, Kansas, which we won with all 3 cars that came in 1, 2, and 3. So then the judges sealed the engine so we couldn't, and sealed the engine and the hood so we couldn't work on the engine. So then from there we went to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the race was there on the next Saturday. but we were rained out. So then Sunday we went to Oklahoma City, and then they won the three races there again. 1, 2, and 3 they came in. But that was all one circuit, just the three, six of us guys there had a ball all the way for a whole week, you know. We're all single and happy at the time. In those races, I was either the gas man or I put, when the car would pull into the pit, I'd go out with a gas can on my shoulder and dump gas in the tank. Or sometimes I would be the tire man. I'd wheel a tire up while a mechanic took the wheel off of the race car, you know, and I wheeled it over to him. And it was fun. I was young. I was only 25, 26. Would you believe it? One time on a Friday, they needed me in Oshkosh. So Mr. Keycaper sent the Cessna plane down from Oshkosh to the Grove Airport in Cedarburg to pick me up and take me back to Oshkosh. When he wanted something, he wanted it right now. Okay, I was at the car garage in Oshkosh again, and they loaded one of the race trucks with car engines and tires and parts. And I drove that truck to Charlotte, North Carolina, and my real instructions were to meet Mr. Keycaper at the Black Welder Hotel, and then he'd tell me what to do. So I met him there, and then he said, well, follow me. He said, well, we went quite a ways through Charlotte to some factory industrial park, and here a cop was sitting waiting for us, and he cut a seal on a door of this one building, and then we could walk in. And Mr. Keycaper told me that this was going to be the new race headquarters for all the. Instead of us hauling them back to Oshkosh every Saturday or Sunday night or Monday morning, we could just leave the cars in Charlotte and have them fixed there. Okay, he was like a kid in a candy store. He and I were the only ones that unloaded that whole truck that day and put all the parts on the floor. So the next day I came to, we stayed at the hotel that night. And I took a cab to the garage the next day, and here Mr. Keycaper was with about 3, 4 salesmen. And he was like a kid in a candy store. He was buying everything. He'd buy hoists, he'd buy wheel align machines, jacks, all the tools, and he bought everything there was that you need to replenish a garage floor. So then the next day I was there again, just he and I alone, and he had me inventory about 60 boxes full of, the little drawers full of all the weatherhead fittings, I had to count everything. Well, that got kind of boring, Then I was still there for a couple more weeks, and then we'd go out on weekends, we'd go out to all the races. By that time, he had all the mechanics come down from Oshkosh to stay in Charlotte, to live there. So there were about at least 20 of us guys hanging around every day. And Keycaper got the bill for us staying at the hotel, and he kind of went through the rope. He had a temper. So he went out and he bought 2 brand new houses. He had 15 beds delivered to each house. That was 30 total for 30 of us guys. And Keycaper slept there also. I kind of got bored standing around. Well, I was putting windshields in all the stock cars after every race because all the tracks were dirt that time and all the windshields got pitted from the race cars in front of them. So I was doing all kinds of stuff, changing spark plugs and blah, blah, blah. And I wanted to go back to Cedarburg and drive my semi again. So one day he was standing there and talking to a salesman, and I went and stood right between the two of them. And he said, Ertl, don't you have anything to do? I said, no. Well, I'm going to send you home. So that very day I flew home on Northwest Air. One way to get out of there. 1957, I was in Memphis, Tennessee, for a NASCAR race, and I don't know why, but I flew home in the twin-engine Beechcraft. And we got around Rockford, Illinois, and it was a pretty wild rainstorm. We were rocking all around and lightning bolts all around. And at that time, I found out what those plastic bags are for in the back of the seats. Okay. Ha ha. When Mr. Keycaper wanted something, he wanted it now. So he must have been in Fond du Lac, and he called up Cedarburg and he wanted the semi for some reason. Couldn't have it because it was already loaded and en route to somewhere. So he had called the Chrysler Corporation and he wanted a new truck. So he sent the plane, the twin engine Beechcraft, down from Oshkosh to the Grove Airport at Highway 60 in Cedarburg and picked me up. And I knew the pilot, Gene Christensen, and he kind of scared me. He said, "This runway's pretty short. I don't know if we'll get this plane off the ground." So when we took off, I could have reached out the window and grabbed a hold of the phone wires right along Highway 60. They took me to Detroit, and I got out of the plane at the Willow Run Airport. From there, I took a cab to the Dodge truck factory, and sure enough, there was a brand new Dodge tractor sitting outside the company gate with my name on it. So I looked it over, and there was no fifth wheel on it. The fifth wheel is a back plate on the truck, on a semi, where you hook the trailer onto it. People don't know what a fifth wheel is, but anyway. So I called Mr. Keycaper, and I told him there was no fifth wheel on the truck. He said, "Well, get one put on." So he told me to call Dick Fruhoff. I called him, and it was about supper time, and he said, "Well, Detroit," and Mr. Fruhoff said, "Detroit is a union town, so I'll have to call in a foreman and a parts department man and a mechanic, all on time, overtime, to do what you want done." So I called Mr. Keycaper back and told him that, and he said, "Well, forget about it." We had prearranged that I was supposed to get that semi and then go to Chicago the next morning down to the Loop where the meet Mr. Keycaper at a hotel in the Loop. And he wanted to look the truck over, but that didn't happen. So next day I just got the fifth wheel mounted on the truck and took the trailer, new trailer, and back to Cedarburg, and that was it for the day. Another time, 57, Mr. Keycaper sent me from Oshkosh with a pickup truck and a boat trailer to New York City. And he said, "When you get to New York, call me." So I got there and I called him. I didn't know what was happening. So I went out on Long Island to a little factory called Marcel Rouault. And he was a Frenchman, and he built a special boat for Keycaper. And I picked up that boat on the trailer, and I brought it back to Oshkosh. And in Oshkosh, the guys took headlights off of a 36 Chevy and mounted them on the deck of the boat. And then they took it back down to Lake X from there in Florida. And that's the boat that they ran around continuously for many days, changing drivers and never shut the engine off. It was the first six-cylinder outboard built by Mercury Outboard. And at the end of the big trial, they advertised the motor is the only motor that went around the whole world without stopping, equivalent to 23,000 miles or something like that. Another time I came to driving with a semi to Lake X. Mr. Keycaper was standing outside. He waved me over, and he said, "Drive your truck over the concrete." He just poured the concrete the day before, and he said he wanted to see if I could crack it or not. Yeah, he had funny ideas, that guy. So I did drive over, and it didn't crack. So that was the end of that story. Another time I went swimming at Lake X one night, and it was dark, and I swam out to a raft, and all of a sudden I heard some splashing. There was Mr. Keycaper just came into the water, he's splashing around. I hollered over, "Carl, come on over here, swim over here." He said, "I can't swim," so I guess he didn't come over. That's another funny deal with him. He's quite a guy. We used to call him Carl all the time because he hated his first name was Elmer, and nobody called him Elmer. Oh, I was at the New York Boat Show in 1958, working in the booth, and Mr. Keycaper had a card table set up in the corner of the booth with a drape around it. And he was in there with the state distributor of Florida. It was Baird Hardware that was the handled the outboard distributorship for the whole state. And he got into an argument with Baird. So I heard him hollering. He was hollering at the guy. He got mad and he canceled the distributorship with Baird Hardware. And that was it. Then after the show was over, he came over to me and told me, take that show material back to Fond du Lac, then load up a load of motors and meet me down at Sarasota. I met him on Siesta Key, that's outside of Sarasota, with my semi with a load of motors. And he said, well, follow me. So here we go again. He drove like a madman. He said, follow me. And he drove like a madman. So, but he'd always wait for me because trying to follow him with a semi didn't work so good. But anyway, we ended up at the Sarasota Bradenton Airport. And there was kind of a bunch of factories and hangars and everything on one end of the building, one end of the airport. So there again, we drove up to a factory, and there was a cop standing there waiting for us. And he went over and cut the ribbon on the door, and then we could go inside, and the cop left. So then I turned the semi around and I backed up to the overhead door. And TK and I opened up the doors on the back of the trailer. You can't reach 13 feet up in the air and get the outboard motors out. So I said, do we really need a forklift? He said to me, well, just wait here a minute, go sit down. So about an hour later, here comes Mr. Keycaver. He went out and bought a big forklift that the contractors use for moving concrete blocks all around at construction sites. So, okay, he drove the forklift and I was in the trailer putting the motors on the forklifts, and then he'd take them inside, and then there was a company rep that took the motors off the forks and lined them up. So after the truck was all unloaded, Mr. Keycaver called Charlie Strang on the phone. Charlie Strang was the head engineer in Oshkosh. In 1958, he was earning $90,000 a year already, which is pretty good money. He said, Charlie, come down here right away. So Charlie jumped down the twin-engine beach and came down to Sarasota Airport. And those are like two kids. They took turns driving their tractor around the whole airport roads, just playing around. And the next morning, Charlie got back on the plane and went back home to Oshkosh. That was funny. Okay, in the corner of that building, there was a big Harnisch-Fager diesel engine mounted on 6x6s. That's the only thing that was in the building before we put our motors in there. So Mr. Keycaver sent me back to Cedarburg to pick up a full load of empty barrels in the backyard of the factory at Plant 1, which I did. I loaded them up, and then I went down to Lake X with them, with the whole semi-load of barrels. In the meantime, he had that Harnisch-Fager diesel moved over to Lake X. They built a barge of all the barrels I brought. Then they mounted that Harnisch-Fager diesel engine on it. And then they put a sand sucker on that, and they sucked out kind of a swampy area in the lake, and pumped up all the sand on the beach and made a beautiful beach and hard surface. So then they built they made a little harbor too for the boats, and then they built a boathouse there. And there again, I was there, and and Mr. Keycaver got a bill for a ready-mix truck that came about 40 miles away, and he went a little wild again, and he was mad at the price. So he went to Orlando, and he bought a whole ready-mix plant. I mean, everything. The big silo where you put the cement in, the powder. He bought 2 new dump trucks, and he ordered, I think, 6 gondola cars, railroad cars delivered to a siding in St. Cloud, which was 9 miles away. Then how do you get the gravel out of the gondola cars? So he bought a drag line. Then he hired a guy that lived there in Florida. He was the character. His name was Gordy Up the Grove. What a name. But anyway, we got to be good friends. And he ran the drag line and scooped out all the gondola cars. And we hauled it there was two new dump trucks to Lake X. And Mr. Keycaper made his own cement there. And then as the years went by, moved that whole cement plant up to Fond du Lac, and that's where he built some of the new plant on Highway 41 with the same ready mix plant. But anyway, he's quite a guy. At Lake X, he built a big boathouse with his ready mix plant that he had there. And then he had about 4 big trailers for all the motor testers that live in that came from Oshkosh for the winter months. And all of us guys would have to jump in cars all the time to go in town for breakfast and supper. So he built 3 or 4 motel rooms right onto the boathouse. Then he built a restaurant there, and he hired 2 full-time cooks, and they made all the meals for us. And it was like being in the army. We all got a tin plate, and then we'd have to stand in line and get our breakfast that way. It was fun. Then he built a timing shack on top of the restaurant, and then he'd stand up there and time the boats as they went around the lake. And that night, a bunch of us guys went to town with cars and had to go to the bar and have a couple beers, When we came back, all the rooms were full and all the trailers were full, and the pilot that flew Mr. Keycaper in that morning said, "Well, I'm sleeping on the floor of the plane." So he did. And there was one room left, and that was Mr. Keycaper's room. And there were 2 beds in it. So I said, "I'll just go sleep with him. What the heck?" I mean, in the same room. Better clarify that. So I did. I got into bed in there. It was right by the window, and there was an air conditioner right above my head in the window. And I don't care for air, so I turned off the air conditioner and went to sleep. And a little while later, he came in. He was out someplace. And he came over to my bed and he turned on the air conditioner again. So I waited till I heard him snoring, and then I turned it off, and we slept the night without air. And he never said a thing to me the next morning. I thought sure he'd holler at me, but he didn't. Oh, another time I was at Siesta Key, and he was there, and with a bunch of vice presidents from all the plants. And he told me to drive them all to the airport. They were all going to go back home that day. So I was driving to the Sarasota airport. And on the way over, I drove over a piece of a palm tree, branch, I mean. And he hollered at me. He was sitting next to me in the front seat. He said, "I drove over some glasses." And I said, "No, that was a piece of palm tree." And then he got mad. He said, "Pull over." So I did, and then he drove the rest of the way to the airport. We made it. I made it, though. Keycaper Corporation invited all of the sports writers from all the big newspapers all around the country for a viewing of the next year's outboards at Lake X. The grass on the lawn was dormant. It was brown. So he called me. I was in Cedarburg. Keycaper called me and told me to go to the paint department and load a 55-gallon of Mercury outboard green into a station wagon and bring it down to Florida. So I did. And when I got there, they had 2 guys spray painting all the grass that was dull brown. They painted the whole area with green paint. He is quite a character. He sure was a fun guy to work for.